And good morning, everybody. We are live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another week of food safety, quality assurance, fantastic products for our wonderful turkey and other foods that are coming up on Christmas Day with our families. And if nobody else says it out there, Jose and I want you to know that we really appreciate it and we say thank you. So if you are new to the food safety chat, pull up a chair. We're going to spend an hour talking about a food safety topic. And one of the things that you'll notice with this is not a presentation. Jose and I are going to be talking about a particular subject, and this is participatory. And this is one of the things I love about doing this every Friday, is the community we're building around food safety with this, because we have a really good group of experts who come on the show and contribute. And if you're new, you're really going to enjoy it, I think, as well. We really do appreciate you taking an hour of your time out of a busy work week to do this, especially on a Friday before a holiday. It just shows your dedication to food safety. So thanks a lot. So Jose, my friend, how are you doing today? Always good when you have you back on the show. You are always an amazing guest. How are you?
No complaints, Brian. Let's put it like that. I mean, but like in our preparation call, I've been doing a lot of reading because this year going to that food lawyers class in DC, oh my goodness, it's something that it really shook me. It's amazing the things that we learn when we read the law.
Yep.
And one thing that I have here is that I mean, during the call, I mentioned to you that my brother was telling me, Jose, you cannot teach regulations unless you understand the law. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I kind of was thinking about is that teaching the regulation without understanding the law is pretty much like walking blind and no stick and no nothing. So you have no clue what you're going to, if you can walk, but you are not 100% there.
Yeah. Well, and I think if you've been watching our chats here in December, you're noticing they're very reflective, and we're looking at the new year. So what are some goals and objectives for yourself, for your companies, and information like this that kind of lets you think. So I think that's really important. So one of the things that we love to do here on the chat as well is put in where you're at in the world. And I'm in Loveland, Colorado, where the weather, Jose, has been absolutely gorgeous. It's been around 60 degrees all week. Today it's going to be 50, but on Christmas Eve, they're predicting snow. So it's kind of an ideal situation here.
Well, I mean, we have about 2 days, Brian, that is very cloudy. I mean, for the Sunshine State, I have not seen the sun in about 2 or 3 days lately. But, well, it is what it is. The temperature is nice. This morning was 67 or something like that.
Nice. Go outside and have your coffee on the deck. And and I mean, part of it too, right, is if you live somewhere where the climate is always the same, you need that variance to appreciate what you have.
Yeah, well, we don't have that much of a variance. Or is the sun out, or is the rain pouring?
Yeah, is it hot or hotter?
Whatever that is, I'm fine with it.
So as we get started here this morning, join Jose and I for some coffee and tea. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Excellent. I'm trying something new this weekend. I bought a, have you seen those little copper cups that you use for making Turkish coffee?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to try making Turkish coffee. It's like a servee, or I forget what those little cups are called. I'm sure I completely screwed that up, but someone will correct me on that.
I remember one time, Brian, in Indonesia, I was doing a job there, and the guy took me to a mall, and there was a coffee shop, and they brought out some very weird made of glass device to filter the coffee, but it was weird. It was some, piping in glass going around, and it was amazing.
Ooh.
So I'm not sure if that Turkish coffee cup will be something similar to that.
Turkish coffee is an experience.
Turkish is famous for
oh,
coffees.
but yeah, everything
Yeah.
needs to be perfect. And there's some really good videos on YouTube, right? This is learning from other people. The world champion, evidently they have championships for making Turkish coffee. And this guy was the world champion. So he was showing the process of how to make Turkish coffee and the different stages that you heat it, you pour it off, and then you let it sit in the right temperatures. Very precise.
Yeah. It's an art.
Yep, absolutely. Which kind of goes into our theme today, which is expertise. In that, one of the things, and there's a famous quote from Socrates as we were preparing for this that I was thinking of, which is, I know I'm intelligent because I know nothing. Right? There's a process you go through when you learn new skills, and you see this more and more, especially with the world of Twitter and all these type of things. The Dunning-Kruger effect. Or is it the other way around? Kruger-Dunning? Where you gain a little bit of knowledge and you think you're an expert. Right?
Yep.
So people on Twitter, you see this, right? I read a study that said this, and all of a sudden they're an expert, right? It's funny because we're seeing this play out in real time.
Yep.
The war in Ukraine breaks out. Everybody on Twitter is an expert in warfare. COVID, everybody knows is an expert on COVID, blah, blah, blah. And they're not. And this belief within this effect is that little bit of knowledge makes you think that you're an expert, and you really know very, very little about the topic. If you continue down that path, you start learning more information and you start realizing, oh crap, I know nothing. And you start reading other information and other studies. And if you continue fighting through that, you then come out the other side and start gaining true knowledge. And that's when you start realizing that really, I'm just scratching the surface on this. And it's a common theme that I see, Jose, when you talk with experts, because anyone can call themselves an expert. But when you talk with experts, that's a common theme that I see. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I'm an expert in microbiology. And I'm amazed every day by the new things I learn about microbes.
Yeah.
If an expert says something like that, that's an expert.
So look at this, Bryan. That same thesis that you mentioned, the Kruger-Dunning, in the introduction of that document, it says that the most important thing that anyone can do is self-awareness. Okay, and there are many different names being used for that same thing, meta-awareness and that kind of stuff. Fine. But it's our ability to question ourselves, to say, am I right or not?
And then constantly going back in that loop.
Yeah. And maybe that is the reason why somehow I was pushed to take that lawyer's class. I mean, do I really have any need for taking a lawyer's class when I'm basically teaching classes and regulations and helping people, consulting, whatever? But not really. But when you have that question in the back, and when you have someone telling you, if you do not know the law, it's going to be very difficult to implement regulations. And you take the class and then you realize and say, oops, yes, I was right. And to support your comment, there is some kind of a saying around there that says that you know what you know, okay? Hopefully, if you question yourself a lot, then there are certain things that someone that is very self-aware knows that you do not know. And then for the vast majority of the knowledge, we have no clue what we do not know.
We don't know what we don't know.
For the vast majority of the knowledge, we have no clue what, I mean, not even that is there.
Yep. And I think today is a good example of this, right? Relative to, and look at this kind of from the high level, is we're going through a detailed issue around this with an example in the regulations and the law. But really, it's the integration of new information and how this fits in. And intelligence is a measure of taking disparate things and connecting them. And if you don't have that base, you can't do the connecting. So you may think that you may think that you have the knowledge, but you really don't. Yeah, as Duncan says here, the unknown unknowns. Everything that we do with human knowledge is this way. Right? So we launch a new telescope into space that's looking at the X-ray spectrum instead of visual. We start seeing an entirely new universe. And every week you read about the universe is older than we thought. Oh, the universe is 15 billion years old. Oops. We found a new galaxy that's even older. Now it's 18 billion years old, right? And it just continues as our knowledge expands. So does our ignorance as well.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's right. So, Bryan, to start our conversation according to your notes, okay?
Yes.
We need to make sure that anyone that is implementing a food safety system, let's go down to earth, down to, quality control, okay? Anyone who needs to implement a food safety system, okay, they must first comply with all of the laws applicable to them.
Mm-hmm.
The laws, not the regulations, okay? And then, according to your product and your process, you look for the specific regulations, you look for the specific requirements in those regulations, whatever is applicable to you or anyone else, and then you develop a system, ISO engineering, for those regulations.
Right.
Okay, so the quick summary of this initial approach is that you need to understand the law, you need to understand the regulation, you need to understand ISO systems, and then is when you can start working on saying, fine, I'm going to set up a system now to comply with those regulations.
Yep. So there's two things that I do when I create systems that you reminded me of. Is the first is I always describe systems in a pyramid, a hierarchy. At the top of that pyramid is the standard you're being evaluated by. So you'll see that as we're going through our conversation. So normally I stop at the regulation. So 21 CFR 117, SQF version 9, whatever that standard is at the top of the pyramid, and then you build your documents out to support the different sections.
Yep.
There's a higher level to that, and that's what we're going to talk about today, and that's the law, right? The law comes before the regulations. The other piece is everything needs to be related to PDCA. Plan, do, check, act. What does the reg say? What process do I have in place to meet those requirements? What do I do to show that I did it? And if it goes wrong, what did I do to put it back on track?
Yeah. Is a methodology that you use to approach systems.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, to my point, after going to that class this year, I kept on reading not only the law, the way that it's written in electronic portal of Congress, the United States Code, but I also got a copy of the Federal Food Drug Cosmetic Act, and I was not clear about the different numbers because FDA is always saying that we need to do whatever it takes in order to prevent the adulteration of food according to Section 402. But when I was going online to the law, that is Section 342, and I said, well, why these numbers are different? It doesn't make any sense. So during that legal class, there was one of the lawyers teaching one of the classes. I was asking him, well, why? And you say, oh, Jose, that is very easy. Look, this is the law when it was written, and this is the codification of the law in Congress. And that's a reason for the different numbers. FDA is citing the number of the written law, and what you're looking is the code that was used to organize the laws in electronic template.
So a set of numbers for the law and a set of numbers for the regulations, and they're not always going to match
everything
up.
is law, Brian. Everything is law. Okay. Let me use names. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is a law.
Mhm.
When you grab a copy of that law, there are certain numbers being used to organize all the content. Okay. Over there, if you go to section 402, that is adulteration. In the written law. Now, when the law was written, the law needs to be aggregated to all of the other laws for all of the other reasons. So the government has a way to organize electronically the different laws. And when they do that, the numbers change, but it still is law.
So that linkage between there is sometimes difficult to follow.
Yes.
Gotcha.
So once you understand that, you're good to go, because now you can go online to the electronic version, or you can read the actual copy of the law. And even though the numbers are different, you know that the content is going to be exactly the same.
Okay. So the two main areas to make sure that I'm understanding this, right? So I'm going to be acting kind of as the voice of our guests here today, like Duncan, is the law, and the law is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The regulations then are the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes. So when the law is written, and I'm going to use FISMA as an example because it's the most recent one. So Congress says, okay, FDA, which is an agency of the executive branch, here is the law. Please make sure that you develop regulations so people comply with the law.
Mhm.
Because at the end, I mean, I'm going to say something that is kind of crazy, but at the end, you may comply with the regulation, but you are not in compliance with the law.
Say that again.
Okay. And it sounds crazy, but I'm going to say it just for this purpose. If I'm a lawyer and you are in full compliance with the regulation, but you are not in compliance with the law, you can go to jail because the full law carries criminal consequences. Yep. And actually, when the FDA cites companies with violations in 483s and warning letters, they always cite the law, not the regulations. You are not in compliance with this and this and this and this. Because of that, your products are adulterated, which is in evidence of not being in compliance with the law, section 402 of the law. What about that?
Now, normally, one of the things that we talk about on 483s and warning letters is adulteration and misbranding. So what do those two fall under?
Okay. So let's go and fine tune a little bit. A few very important things that are in the law. Okay. I will say, and this is something that I frequently, if not all the time, teaching during the classes. I mean, if you guys are going to be developing a food safety system, question is very simple. What is food and what is a system? Those are the two key words there, okay? So going to the definition of food, you don't have that definition in regulations. That definition is in the law. You need to go to the section for definitions in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Over there, the definition of food is anything that is food or drink. So a Coke and a juice and milk is food too. And look at this one, Brian, for men or other animals. Okay? So in theory, I know that I'm going to stretch to an extreme the definition right now. If let's say that I have an Oreo cookie, okay, in my hand, and I'm going to see, I don't know, let's say that there is a culture here that I have on my table, and that culture contains Listeria monocytogenes. I'm going to dip the Oreo cookie in the Listeria monocytogenes, and I have the Oreo cookie right here.
Okay.
So, of course, if I eat this, that cookie is adulterated. I cannot give that cookie to an animal.
Mm-mm.
Because the definition, the same way that is adulterated for humans is adulterated for animals.
And I've talked about this before then, Jose. I'll get your take on this, is that I've seen this with FSMA, right? So you have food for humans, food for animals under FSMA.
Mm-hmm.
FDA has said those two things are equivalent. If you're an animal producer, you have to follow the same rules as human food, and you have to have a risk assessment and preventive controls and all these type of things. So they're merging to that standard definition then.
Yeah. Actually, Bryan, look at this. If you, let's say that you say, okay, Jose, you are the FDA now. Organize the laws and the regulation as you please.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to organize the regulations, and I'm going to say, guys, this section here is the GMP for anyone manufacturing food. And it doesn't matter if it's for animals or humans.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And this is a section. Okay. Those that are making food for animals, they follow these extra requirements. Those that are making dietary supplements, they need to follow these extra requirements. But writing a regulation for preventive control for animals, and then another regulation preventive control for having exactly the same definition of preventive control, corrections and corrective actions, the management component, doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Well, and part of this too, right, is, and this is why this conversation is so interesting, is you're also then looking at the history. Because this all didn't happen in a vacuum and sprung out of the head of a Greek god, right? Things happened over time. So a law was written, and then additional information was written, and then FDA or USDA or whatever would try and implement those things. And you create this kind of this piecemeal circuitry over time, right? So FSMA was an attempt to kind of reconsolidate that back under these different systems.
Yeah, and to continue with the definition of food has 3 different meanings. The second one is chewing gum, even though that we're not swallowing the gum, but yeah, the liquid, we're swallowing that. And then number 3 is that all of the ingredients that are being used to make food must be food. And that's a reason why if you go to California and you go to one of those places where you can buy a brownie with marijuana, well, in California, that is okay. But within the borders of the state, as soon as that food goes out of the state, the product is adulterated because marijuana is not food.
Right.
Okay? So to my point, understanding that and understanding what I typically call the 3 main prohibitions in the food law. Okay? Number 1, it is prohibited to receive anything that is adulterated or misbranded. Okay? Which, by the way, remember that you're using food. You cannot receive something that is not supposed to be food. So any of the food that you receive is adulterated or misbranded, you're criminals. People are going to be identified as criminals. According to the law, it's a prohibited act. Okay, and then once you have the food and whatever are the activities performed, if those activities are not being performed under sanitary conditions, the products are going to be adulterated. Okay, to our conversation 2 days ago, Bryan, let's say that the FDA shows up and I'm the owner of a facility and I'm going to say nobody's going to be using hairnets. Why? Because a little bit of hair is not going to kill anyone, so it's not a hazard. Who cares? Right? And FDA is going to say, oh, you're not using hairnets? Okay, you are working under insanitary conditions because you are going to allow the inclusion of something that is not food into the food.
Right. And in that situation, FDA does not have to show direct evidence. Well, there's no, okay, I don't have hairnets on, but there's no hair in the food. FDA is going to say, I don't care, in sanitary conditions.
Yes. And the third prohibition is to ship something that is adulterated or misbranded. Okay? So why I'm highlighting those things, okay? So number one, imagine that you receive, and I was talking about this with an FSPP class that I was teaching Monday and Tuesday. There was a lady that receives green coffee beans. Look at this one, green coffee beans, okay? She is the FSPP importer, okay? And they are purchasing these from a company that is gathering the coffee from different farms, put it in bags, and then ship it out. Okay? So now, because they are buying green coffee beans, the regulation says that there is evidence that nobody eats green coffee beans.
Correct.
Okay, so at some point, it is expected that there will be a process, roasting and grinding and whatever that is going to be done before consumption. So at that point, yeah, they can import the food. The green beans are going to come with salmonella, I bet you. That is there, and E. coli eventually. They're being dry in these very huge places, just to the sun. Sorry about that. So now look at this. Can you receive those green beans with the E. coli and the salmonella? Yeah, you can do that. It's not an issue. Now, is that the only approach? Is that the only way that you will say, okay, so this is it, and I'm just importing and that's it in my hazard analysis in the FSPP? No. Why? Because in coffee beans, you may have mycotoxins. Look at this example. Okay, so now, can you receive green beans with Salmonella and E. coli? Yes. Can you receive green beans with mycotoxin? No. Because the farm that was growing, according to the definition of the FDA, of the supplier is the farm that is growing, they cannot ship a product that is adulterated because they will be committing a crime. So who is the one controlling the mycotoxins? The farm.
The farm.
And if the farm ships a raw product with salmonella and E. coli and mycotoxins to the market, they're committing a crime. Anyone that received that product, if they do not have some controls, some procedures to make sure that that is not happening, well, that person is going to be part of the same crime because they just received something and used and shipped something that is adulterated or misbranded.
Right. So two things to follow up on that, right? And you're 100% right. So the first one is, this is why we see within recalls that things move relatively quickly if they find an ingredient in the supply chain that is adulterated. So let's say you've got flour with salmonella. They can then look at that supply chain and recall everything without further testing because they already know that the material is adulterated and you cannot produce a product with adulterated ingredients, therefore recall. The other point is, here's another story relative to exactly what you're saying with coffee, is sugar. So I used to work for a sugar refinery, and we would bring raw sugar into the US. Raw sugar, not for human consumption. It wasn't food yet.
Here you go.
So we would bring in giant ships full of sugar, 30,000 metric tons in giant ships, and clamshell it out and transport it to a giant warehouse where we put it in big piles. And then we would refine it into food. So on that raw material, did I look for salmonella and things like this? No. Did I look for other risks that needed to be controlled at the supplier level? Yes. I looked for heavy metals and other contamination within the sugar.
Yep.
So knowing what we're talking about here is super important because I got in an argument with the state of Texas with the sugar. So a local inspector came in. So in Texas, local Texas inspectors will contract with FDA to do FDA audits. They came in to see my big warehouse and they went, look at all this food stored in this giant warehouse. You don't have GMPs, you don't have whatever. And I'm like, no, this is not food. We're going to make it into food, but it's not food yet. And they had a really hard time understanding that because they didn't understand what you're talking about, which is law versus regulation.
Yep.
And so we were very careful in our refineries to define in that plant that line of this side is raw, not food. Food.
Yep.
It's the same with coffee, right? Once you roast the coffee and process it, it becomes food.
Yes. Yes. So let me use another example. Now that we started talking about this started with the coffee beans, look at this. So after that class, I start getting very curious, very concerned, and asking myself a lot of questions about risk assessment. And I start reading a lot ISO 31000 and the ISO 31010 with the risk assessment techniques to try to calm my mind and say, what's going on? How can we effectively determine risk? And then in engineering, it's very common that once we determine risk and we set up a control, we are supposed to measure the effectiveness of that control, which for us in food quality control is typically called validation. If we validate our control, what you're actually saying is how effective was the control in reducing the risk. Now, look at this example that I have here, okay? Let's say that there is someone develops a hazard analysis for a product. And something that I saw a lot in my audits is that people are not identifying exactly the organism of concerns. They are saying, to say something, oh, we may have some pathogens here under biological, and we may have some bacterial growth and whatever. And I'm going to say, well, hold on. There are cases, like, for example, you receive several raw materials, and some of them may have hazards. Can you group them all together in the step of cooking, pasteurizing, frying, or something like that, and say, I'm going to be controlling all of the microbiological pathogens from raw ingredients in this step? Yeah, you can do that. Okay? Yeah, most likely you can do that. However, you need to be very careful, because if, let's say that the process is a pasteurization process and you have background in pasteurization of milk and cheeses and whatever, I mean, you go online to 21 CFR 131, the milk standard, and in that section, FDA has listed this temperature for pasteurization, this amount of time, this temperature, this amount of time, this temperature, and it's up to you to select the one that you want, that one that is better for you according to your own knowledge. Now, to my point, pasteurization is a thermal process that is considered a mild thermal process. Okay, so if your load is the typical load from raw milk coming from a farm in, a period of time of 1 day or 2 days, whatever, most likely that process is going to be enough. Now, if you receive a milk that has been going around and waiting and holding for a certain amount of time, and that load of bacteria is huge, maybe that combination of time and temperature is not going to be enough.
Right.
Bring that down to an acceptable level. So the residual risk is not acceptable.
Right.
Because it was defined only based on time and temperature and not the initial load of the bacteria going into the process.
Exactly. So a couple of points on that came to mind. So pasteurization generally has about a 10 to the 5 log reduction. If you are higher than that, things are going to get through. And that's why in your milk plant, you keep your raw milk cold, right? Raw milk plants that are making cheese, to your example, Jose, spend a lot of money making sure that that raw material is kept cold. Why? To keep that bacterial count down below that delta associated with pasteurization. Now, with that, you also need to look at other things. So let's say, for example, in that milk, you have staph that produces a stable heat toxin that would go right through that process. That happened to Snow brand milk in Japan. They were bringing back milk, Jose, from retailers and reworking it. So one of their plants had that bright idea. So they would take open the cartons in the plant, pour it into a big tank, and run it back through the pasteurizer. No one knew about it. That system wasn't being cleaned. Bacteria grew, toxin was produced, and tens of thousands of people in Japan got sick. The CEO resigned, and 5 years later, a $7 billion company in Japan was out of business because of that.
Yeah. So, to my point, Bryan, systems, risk assessment. If you identify whatever is a hazard, okay, whatever is a hazard at this point is not relevant. Okay, so in order to produce a safe milk, you have 3 different controls. One, maintaining the raw product below certain temperature to prevent the initial load of bacteria from getting too high, so the pasteurization cannot get rid of that. That by default is high risk. And the storage is going to be a critical control point. A process preventive control. You name it as you wish. Okay, well, that's number one.
Yeah.
Yes, because it's high risk. It's a combination of controls, the one that is going to really lower the risk. So then the pasteurization process, you need to prove that it's going to be effective. And then the refrigeration of the product, because the product may still contain something. You mentioned it's about 5 log reductions. So now the refrigeration of the product after the manufacture is a process preventive control too. Yeah. And the effectiveness of the system in controlling the hazard relies on 3 controls, not just one. So you need to look at those 3 controls as a group of controls that are designed to reduce to an acceptable level.
Right. And this all applies to risk assessment, which really in your food safety plan is one of the hardest things for plants to do, is to put together their risk assessment. So to your point, Jose, they list out ingredients, processes, physical, chemical, microbiological threats to the product. And then the next step is, what's the severity and likelihood? And most people are like, yeah, they kind of they got a dart that they throw at the dartboard. And they're like, I think the risk is medium, but the severity is low, right? And they may have some documentation around that. But really what you're saying here is how all of this applies to risk assessment, right?
Mm-hmm. So, again, Bryan, if you use, which I don't have any problem, HACCP technique, and by the way, I'm going to repeat this, HACCP is not a system. HACCP is a risk assessment technique, okay? So if you use the HACCP technique, principle number 1 is the hazard analysis. You identify whatever is the sources from ingredients or from the process, you identify the hazards, and then you must go through a risk assessment. And you need to determine what is the severity of that hazard, by hazard, you cannot group them. You need to be specific. And then you need to determine the likelihood. And it is extremely likely that most of the controls cannot be effectively, most of the risk of the hazards cannot be effectively reduced with just one control. It is possible that you will need more. And unless you have evidence of the reduction achieved by one or more controls, you cannot ship the product because you don't have the evidence that the product is safe.
So of those three parameters that you were talking about, suppliers, production, and shipping, you cannot move adulterated or misbranded products through those channels.
Yep, exactly right. So to my point, I'm going to use an example that has that I have here, and it's the one that we use in our previous conversation. Imagine an FSBP importer. Okay, someone is going to import frozen berries. Okay. In the hazard analysis of the FSBP importer, I'm supposed to, as much as possible, to try to identify hazards that are typical in frozen berries. Okay. So for that reason, I may go anywhere, but I'm going to use the FDA. I'm going to use the FDA recalls, enforcement reports. What is the most typical hazard in berries? Hepatitis A.
Yes.
Okay. So let's go through the risk assessment. What is the severity of hepatitis A if someone eats a berry with hepatitis A? Oh, that person is going to get ill. Some people may go to hospital, and even though that is not likely death, there is still a chance for death, believe it or not. Okay? So just by reading and understanding that, is that hepatitis A very serious hazard? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Okay, fine. So that is the severity. Done with the assessment of the severity. Now, likelihood. Well, I'm not sure how people are going through these likelihood assessments. A lot of people are using some rubrics, and those rubrics are just pulled from the hairs because there is nothing consistent that people can actually read and measure to determine likelihood. Even though I'm not asking for an exact identification of likelihood, but at least something that is going to give you some document that can support that likelihood that people is saying. So, but in that case, I'm going to say, if you can see that there are recalls because of the hepatitis A in frozen berries, I'm going to say that is enough evidence to show that people, whomever was the company manufacturing that frozen berry, they were not capable of controlling disease because the source of hepatitis A is humans. Okay, right. We are the source for that. So at that point, I'm going to say, okay, so what is the source? If humans are the source and I'm receiving frozen berries, I'm going to say, which are the potential sources where those berries may got adulterated? And I can think of two options. Number one, the employees that were harvesting the berries at the farm. That's option number one. They are handling the fruit. It is possible that that happened over there. And remember that hepatitis A is not going to get killed because of the freezing conditions.
Right.
In the regulation, in the produce safety rule regulation for farms, because berries are covered produce, and because they're covered produce, they are supposed to have people, according to, I have a note here, 112.22A1, people are supposed to receive training in principles of food hygiene at the farm level. That must be effective, by the way. In 122C says that each and every single farm must have a responsible party that went through the grower training of the FDA. Must. Okay? And then 112.31 says that you must take measures to prevent contamination of covered product or food contact surfaces with microorganism of public health certificate from disease of employees. Okay? Is there. A lot of people, if you look at the regulation for produce safety, the produce safety regulation is only for biological hazards. And the FDA is basically, when we teach a classes, we're telling people these are the sources of these hazards. So in the produce safety rule, you don't have the GNPs and then the preventive controls or the hazard plan. You just identified hazards and that's it.
Right. They're all together.
You don't have that separation. Now, if I'm purchasing these berries from the company that received the berries from the farm, and they prepare the berries and freeze the berries and whatever, are they also handling? Is there people handling there? Yes. So is it possible that the berries got adulterated there? Yes. And that is when we start having issues, because anyone that is cutting, packing, freezing, whatever, that is a facility. They need to register with the FDA. And according to those operations, most likely they will need to be in compliance with 117, the preventive controls. So because it's preventive controls, what is supposed to be in their own hazard analysis? Identified hepatitis A from the berries coming from the farm. Because if the farmer is shipping the berries with hepatitis A, that berry was adulterated during the harvesting portion.
Right.
They were working under insanitary conditions, and that is criminal activity. They cannot ship that product.
Right. So that's the first leg of that three-legged stool. You cannot ship adulterated material.
Even the farms.
Right.
So
And this goes back
that,
to, oh, I'm sorry, just a quick observation here. This goes back to point of control. The only point in that supply chain where the hepatitis can be controlled is at the farm. No one else upstream can remove the hepatitis.
Because the product is ready to eat. But the what I believe, Bryan, that is the most important concept here is to understand the intent of the law.
Yeah.
And that intent indicates that because of a lack of effective training in food safety and food hygiene, the farm workers were allowed to work when they're sick, and they adulterated the food, and they now ship the fruit. That is the first crime.
Yes.
Now, the facility that is receiving the fruit to be frozen, to freeze the fruit, they're also committing a crime, because in their own hazard analysis, they have not identified the hepatitis A from the workers that are picking the fruit from the fields. Okay? And because of that, at that point, they're committing a crime. Now, the problem that we have now is that because of that crime, they were not aware of that, because it is basically impossible to find a hazard analysis of a packing house, a company freezing berries that are going to identify hepatitis A in a farm. So is that hazard control? No, it's not control.
Right. Interesting.
There you go. Now, let's say that company is concerned about their own employees. Let's say, okay? How many times you have seen in your experience, and how many times I have seen in my experience, hepatitis A in a hazard analysis?
Very rare.
I can tell you that if I saw it 1 or 2 times, it's a lot in 9 years of auditing intensively.
Right.
And the question is very simple. Why? Oh, Jose, the answer is very simple, because we control that with the GNPs. The reason why people is controlling that with the GNPs is exactly the reason why there is a lot of recalls, because a GNP control is not being performed frequent enough and intense enough to really control that hazard and prevent shipping the product with that hazard.
Right. So that is easily knocked down by FDA if they come in and do an inspection. So let's say FDA is investigating a hepatitis outbreak in frozen berries and they go to the manufacturer. Oh, I've got GMPs in place. My employees wash their hands and these type of things. FDA is going to say, that's nice. What are you doing to verify that there's no hepatitis A in your incoming raw material?
Yeah. 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 So because of that is when I was going back and reading the regulation. You have the definition, Bryan, that I showed you in the law, the definition of the preventive controls. Can you please put that up? Aha. So now look at this. When I'm teaching the class, I'm always teaching the class, guys, you may have process preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, allergen preventive controls, and supply chain. Okay. But nobody is emphasizing the other controls that are there. So when I realized that when you read the regulation, that when you read the law, the law, look at the definition of preventive controls. In the definition of preventive controls, you do not have process preventive controls. You do not. They are being called critical control points. So what that means, that if you have a HACCP program, HACCP, not preventive controls, and you already identified hazards in that process and you set up some critical control points, well, that is equivalent to the process preventive controls. So HACCP is acceptable.
Interesting. And this is the part that blew my mind when we were talking about this earlier. So normally under FSMA, you look at your prerequisite programs and your preventive controls. Oh, okay, preventive controls for a ready-to-eat facility include environmental monitoring, supplier management, allergens, and sanitation. This doesn't agree with that.
It's not matching. Okay, even though that we can eventually group them and came out with what the FDA has. I don't have any problem. Okay, so I'm going to match. When the FDA read these definitions, they said, okay, we are not going to call the process preventive controls critical control points because we want to avoid talking about HACCP, let's say. Right. Okay, so instead of saying critical control points, the first type of preventive controls is going to be called a process preventive control. And I'm going to be asking people to set up the management component, which is nothing different from the principles in HACCP. Okay, fine. We have the first one down. Now, go to the definition of preventive controls. And then, number one, there is a food allergen control program. Oh, that is your allergen preventive control. And FDA says, make sure that you use the same 7 principles. Yeah. Because why you're using these same 7 principles? It's a risk assessment technique. And it's a risk assessment technique that is proven to work in the food industry. But in a system, you must identify what is the risk assessment technique that is going to be used. So use the same technique for anything that is here in yellow under the preventive controls, which allergen is one of those. Then the second is the sanitation preventive controls. And looked at the beginning, A as in Apple says, sanitation procedures for food contact surfaces and utensils and food contact surfaces of equipment. That is a sanitation preventive control. Yeah. And that is going to be used in combination with CSIN Charlie, which is the environmental monitoring program to verify the effectiveness of the control. Because when you clean, you are basically reducing the likelihood of occurrence. That is a control. And you have no clue if that control works or not unless you swab. And what is a swab in the environmental monitoring program? So it's a system. The only thing is that these guys were writing this way, in a way weird. And what is amazing, Bryan, is emphasizing, Frank, the current good manufacturing practices, which is the other controls in the regulation. And that means that anything that is that is covered, but that is controlled by GMPs. If you go through a risk assessment, and assuming that this risk assessment is properly done, okay, so that's the reason why I'm always saying that risk assessment is the main problem here. Assuming that that risk assessment is properly done, we're going to find a lot of different hazards that are being controlled by GMPs, but I'm going to say not sufficiently controlled. We are not reducing the risk to an acceptable level with the GMPs. And for that reason is when the FDA, the law actually says you need a preventive control.
Interesting. So that this piece right here is very significant, and we're getting short on time here. So let's kind of bring this up for everybody. What are the implications, Jose? What you're digging up here? What does all this mean?
So to my point, Bryan, and this is one of the very funny things. I started teaching the preventive controls for human and animal food basically since 2016. Okay. And I mean, so far I have been teaching as truthful as possible to the regulation. But after taking this class this year, oh my goodness, it's different. I need to tell people what is the intent, and I need to explain risk assessments.
Right.
In the class, you need to check the severity and you need to check the likelihood and so on. Fine, that's okay. But if there is no effective way to do that, forget it. It's not going to work. Right. And as of right now, what we're doing, most of the people, what they're doing is, Jose, we're going to use the matrix provided by BRC, GFSI, SQF, whatever. But those matrices may not be validated.
So it's back to our full circle to what we were talking about at the beginning, what Duncan's talking about here. Dunning-Kruger, right? You are learning new expertise and realizing, and I am through this as well, there's more to know.
Yeah.
Right. So I think part of this too, to take away from this is don't take this information and go back to your facilities and blow up your food safety plans. Hey.
No.
But you need to understand, and this is why it's so important, because when you work in quality assurance and food safety, one of our main partners in doing this are lawyers. Yes. And lawyers speak about the law. And number one, I always talk about this, Jose, is you need a good food safety lawyer, a lawyer that specializes in what we're talking about and can translate it so that we can understand it. But the basis of what they're doing is what we're talking about here. They're going to go to the law first and then to regulations. So we also need to understand their language. So if all of a sudden we hear a lawyer talking about, well, when you look at Section 420 or whatever, and in there they're talking about the requirements of preventive controls relative to training. And you say, well, wait a minute, training is not a preventive control, that's prerequisite. It is according to the law. Training is
because if the risk of the lack of effective training is high because of the hazard that are going to be controlled by effective training, that is a preventive control.
Right.
Everything is about the risk assessment, Bryan. That's what we need to understand.
And it's the most challenging part of writing a good food safety plan, but it's the most important.
It is. Yep.
Absolutely. That's a lot to think about for sure. and this is the time of year to think about these things. And sit back and reflect and go, are there things I need to be looking at, ways of expanding my knowledge? And so, Jose, that's why I admire you so much, is you're constantly growing and evolving and seeking out new information. And I think that's a secret to success in life too. Always be learning, always be growing, always challenge what you believe. Which is why when people say the science is settled, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Science is never settled. The process of science is challenging science.
Yep.
learning more and more and more and growing.
Yep.
Same thing here.
Yep.
Wow. Great chat. Lots to digest here. And just I'll throw this in the chat just for fun. Excuse me, I looked up while we were talking the recalls for frozen fruit for hepatitis. You can use this link to go and see that. Use foodindustrycouncil.com to research recalls. Super valuable. And I thank Sean Stevens for that every week. When you look at this data in 2023, we've had 7 recalls for hepatitis A. In 100% of those, Jose, frozen fruit.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Crazy. So everybody, we're going.
Hepatitis A is not part of a hazard analysis. I have no clue.
Right, it needs to be.
Yeah.
So there's an action plan for everybody to take away from our chat here this week, which we are going to close out now. Tons to think about. And thank you, Jose, again, for all this knowledge and information and sharing that. We all greatly appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone in the audience who's here. Duncan, everyone else, thank you for being here for the chat here this week. And we will be back here next week with our next food safety chat. And another expert, another amazing person like Jose will be on the show with me. We live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Mountain Time. And this is amazing. So everybody have a great holiday, and we'll see you back here next Friday. Thanks, Jose.
Thank you, Bryan.
Thanks, everyone.
Holidays.